Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 6 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have won 5-3. So just like they did against the St. Louis Blues and just like they did against the Arizona Coyotes, they split down the middle in these little 2-game series that they will have all season long, except this time, instead of having to go to the shootout to get the victory, they end up getting their first regulation win of the season with this 5-3 score. Now, this game started off quite well for San Jose. In fact, their first period was one of their more dominant periods of this entire year thus far, and yet it was the Minnesota Wild who would score the first goal of this game from Zach Parise. It would be the Sharks actually getting quite lucky near the end of the first, in the last minute or so, where Ryan Donato would get a very fortunate bounce off of, I believe, Jared Spurgeon to tie the game up at 1 and give the Sharks at least some confidence after a strong 20 minutes going into the second period. And in that second period, the Sharks would make a statement. They would score the next 2 goals of the game from both Kane and Noah Gregor, and by about the halfway mark of the second period, the Sharks will have limited the Minnesota Wild to just about 6 shots on goal. However, from that point onward, the Minnesota Wild seemed to wake up. They would get the next 2 goals of this game, one in the second period coming from Bjugstad, and then one in the third period coming from Kevin Fiala, and the tie game would last for a pretty long while, and it looked like we would be heading for a third straight overtime game and for the potential of the Sharks winning yet another shootout. But in the last 2 minutes of the third period, it would be Brent Burns scoring one of the most impressive goals I have ever seen, as he goes through basically the entire Wild squad, single-handedly scores this goal to put the Sharks up by 1, and eventually a Matt Nieto empty netter ends this game. And I mean, I take a look at, let's say, one of the goals of the year from just a couple years ago when it was Tomas Hertl who deked out Cam Fowler, I believe, shorthanded to score past John Gibson against the Ducks, and that ended up being a top 10 goal of the year. And this Brent Burns goal is like 10 times better than that one, so I cannot imagine that unless something crazy happens, that this isn't a, top 5, maybe even just best goal of the year, because this was an incredibly impressive display from Brent Burns, single-handedly making this one happen and getting the victory for the San Jose Sharks. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He ends up back between the pipes here tonight after a loss for Devan Dubnyk. No, not a terrible loss, I guess, for him in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild, and it was a pretty up and down game for Martin Jones, as it was for the Wild goaltender himself. While Jones didn't have too much of a chance on Parise's one, though I guess technically he could have made the save, and the Bjugstad goal was a tip, he absolutely should have had the save here on Kevin Fiala, completely unscreened from quite far out. Just poor positioning from Martin Jones ends up leading to the goal that would eventually tie the game at 3. That's more of the downside of what Martin Jones was tonight. However, the upside was that Jones actually made a lot of pretty solid saves from the moment the Wild scored that third goal. He ended up being a bit of a brick wall. There were a few key saves. One in particular on Nick Bonino with around 90 seconds remaining in the third period was a huge one, where he comes out to challenge and makes a big save on Bonino, and just in general, a couple of other solid saves here or there. Now, I don't exactly know if Martin Jones will start the next game, considering after a 2-1 shootout victory for Martin Jones, they ended up going with Devan Dubnyk. It's possible that the Sharks will once again go with Devan Dubnyk for this next game. However, I would not be surprised, and I would probably like to see Martin Jones in nets, even though he hasn't completely separated himself from Devan Dubnyk just yet. It does seem as though Jones is getting the edge so far in this battle for the starting goaltender on the Sharks this season. Next, I'm going to be talking about the Sharks' 6th defenseman, and Knyzhov. So, coming into camp this season, people thought Shemek would be completely healthy, the Sharks would have a solid top 5 defensive core, and the 6th defenseman would be Jacob Middleton playing like 8 minutes a night. But unfortunately, first of all, Shemek ended up still dealing with these lingering injury issues, so he hasn't been able to play the usual amount of minutes that he was able to play when he was completely healthy a couple of years back. And Middleton was, even more disappointing than you would think. And so, someone who in training camp managed to step up was Knyzhov. And while his first few games of the season were somewhat rocky, where he was okay and still better than the rest of the competition for the 6th defenseman spot, he wasn't fantastic and was at times a liability. I do think he has come into his own here in these last couple of games. And this night in particular, I thought he was quite solid. A couple nice defensive plays, even getting up involved in the offense, which is something we basically have not seen from him at all through the first few games of this season. And so him really getting involved like this, I did enjoy. And so it definitely would be a good thing with all the worrying that we have been doing about some of the other Sharks defensemen like Karlsson, Burns, Vlasic. It definitely would be a good thing if that sixth defensive spot can be somewhat locked down, and Knyzhov seems to be well on his way to being able to do that. Next player I'd like to talk about is Ryan Donato. Another solid game from Donato, and he really is beginning to make a bit of a name for himself in this Sharks team. There have been a lot of sort of sporadic plays from a lot of Sharks players this season where, one game Logan Couture will look fantastic and the next game he'll be somewhat invisible, and that's not just the case with Couture, it's the case with Kane, Meier, Hertl, Burns, Karlsson. All these players will have the occasional great game and then the occasional game where you would barely notice if they weren't actually playing, or you would wish they weren't actually playing for some of them. But with Ryan Donato, it seems as though he's always really putting in the effort. He's always really this energetic forward. He's not always participating super heavily in the offense, but he definitely is a bit of like a firecracker out there, really trying his best, really going after pucks, really working, really getting shots on net, just all the things that, for most NHL coaches, they just love to see in a player like Donato. And so while maybe not on the best of best NHL teams would Donato be a top six forward, but with currently what the Sharks have working with, Donato is a very strong top six forward for them, and he's definitely been doing a great job at proving that, even though his goal tonight wasn't necessarily extremely skillful, obviously was a lucky bounce as I mentioned earlier. It does just, it's rewarding for the work that Donato seems to put in, game out, and he certainly is one of the Sharks players who's seemingly putting in the most effort here through the first few games of this season. And finally, I'll talk about Dylan Gambrell, a player who has been basically in and out of the lineup for a few years now for the San Jose Sharks. And at the start of the season, he couldn't even get a spot into the starting lineup. First game of the season, it was Joel Shellman, who was the fourth line center. Then you had Stefan Nason coming in. Then you had Handemark coming in. And then finally, Gambrell would make his season debut. And while it didn't start off super well for him, he really has, gotten better as these last couple of games have gone on. And here tonight, I thought Gambrell was incredibly effective on this line with Gregor and Meier, one of the Sharks' better lines of the night. In the end, Meier, who had been demoted for this game because of his sort of sporadic play on the second line with Kane and Hertl, ends up actually getting re-promoted back to that second line by the end of this game because of how well this line clicked. And it wasn't just Meier carrying the other two players, but Gambrell and as well Gregor, you could say, both looked quite solid. So Gambrell, this centerman prospect for the Sharks that for, as I said, many years the Sharks were really hoping to sort of come around and become a solid third line center for them. I don't want to speak too soon after just, a one or two solid games from him, but he is beginning to at the very least sort of cross that take that next step forward into becoming a solid NHL player. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action yet again in another 2 days, where they will take on the Colorado Avalanche. Yes, they have played the Blues this season already, and the Blues are a tough team, but the Avalanche will certainly be their toughest challenge yet, and we'll see how the Sharks can stack up against one of the divisions, or if not the division's best team. Class dismissed.